I'm Park Howell, and welcome to the Business of Story, where I consult, teach, coach, and speak on the applied science and bewitchery of brand and business storytelling, so that you can clarify your story to amplify your impact and simplify your life.
I thought it was just a stupid picture of a pig in the ocean. But after hearing that story, I had to have it. Now I wasn't just buying a picture. I was buying a story. Story literally made the picture worth more money to me.
That's what businesses are about. People buy brands. People buy stories much more than anything else.
I work with a lot of big enterprise companies, but let's just say I always tell folks, drop the PowerPoint, close your laptops, start with your story.
If you want people to get engaged and you want people to act, you have to tell them an emotionally powerful story. That's with great characters, it's with uncertain outcomes, and it's with high stakes and drama.
All business strategy is a story.
Welcome back to the Business of Story. I'm your intrepid storytelling host, Park Howell. And man, am I excited about today's show. With us is one of America's first true pioneers in sustainability, who is going to share how he's turned adversaries into allies to help advance the sustainability goals of one of America's most iconic brands. Since you're listening, you are probably a leader of a for-profit or non-profit purpose-driven brand yourself, and you're seeking ways to advance your positive social impact further, faster through your brand storytelling. But what if the tables were turned? What if you were a prominent executive in a brand that was once embraced and beloved by just about everyone, only to be made out the villain once environmental action groups became more vocal in the 1980s? How would you turn around the growing perception of your brand as polluter into a proactive business model and sustainable action plan to become one of the world's leaders in sustainability, even if your progress felt like 3 steps forward, then 2 steps, and maybe even 2.5 steps back? Sharing that journey with us today is the retired Vice President of Sustainability for McDonald's, Bob Langert. Bob spent 27 years helping launch, manage, and grow McDonald's social and environmental efforts. And he is now Senior Sustainability Advisor for the Context Group and writes a column for GreenBiz called Inside View. In January, Bob published his first book, The Battle to Do Good, Inside McDonald's Sustainability Journey, chronicling through first-person stories how he, Mickey D's leadership, and their teams worked to create positive impact while serving up their Big Mac. His book has become one of my important resources on advancing sustainability because he offers no opinions and no assertions. But he makes his business case through true stories well told, allowing you, the reader, to make up your own mind about what works and what doesn't in the often contentious industry of sustainability. From their very first recycling initiative that almost thwarted their earnest efforts, to working with the legendary Dr. Temple Grandin on more humane ways to handle their beef supply, to learning how to turn doubters and deniers into allies, Bob shares a bit of his journey with you right now on the Business of Story. Bob, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me, Park.
There's not many people that I know, maybe you are probably the only one, that fell into sustainability and helped pioneer the industry with, arguably one of the most iconic brands in America and everything you experienced in that. How did you get your start in sustainability and at McDonald's? And can you take us to a time as a young man or, in your formative years in college? In hindsight, it was a moment that has shaped and informed who you are today as a sustainability practitioner.
Well, it was really fortuitous that I fell into sustainability. I'll start with how I got the opportunity, then backtrack into probably how I was meant to be in this profession. I moved to McDonald's in 1983, and I was in charge of truck drivers. I was in charge of logistics and warehouse people for about 10 years. And then one day in summer of 1988, a bigger boss came to my office. He said, Bob, we're getting killed on this issue of polystyrene foam container. People are starting to not like McDonald's. We got nobody in the company that knows anything about environmentally friendly packaging. We don't even know what we're doing. We don't know what the right thing to do is. Can you take a temporary job to help us figure it out? So I always wondered why George picked me, he could have picked anybody. Like, what made him pick me to take this on? It ended up being just a wonderful career of so many things. And I think it goes back, I grew up in the 60s. So to me, my formative years was with my older brother, 4 years older than me. We listened to every protest song there was. I mean, I was really into the anti-war movement, the whole counterculture of the mid-60s. I was too young to directly participate. Mm-hmm. But, I suffered when John F. Kennedy got killed. I saw Bobby Kennedy on TV when he died. I went to my local park as a 10-year-old. I mean, how many 10-year-olds ride their bike to see Martin Luther King march on the south side of Chicago? I saw him getting stoned and just cursed. Martin Luther King, I read later that he thought he had the worst treatment ever in his life in my local park on the south side of Chicago. And I was there. I saw it all. And I go, these are my friends. These are my neighbors. They're treating this person in the most horrible fashion.
By the way, how old were you then, Bob?
When I saw Martin Luther King, he did a big march in 1966. I was 10 years old.
So you were 10 years old. Was it a social thing that was driving you? I mean, at 10 years old, we don't have a whole lot of life experience. So do you think first the music, listening to that, drove that passion, and then your curiosity took you there to figure out what's actually everyone talking about?
As early as the early 60s, when John F. Kennedy died, I remember as a 9-year-old, he died when I was 7 years old. I remember reading articles about him in the book profiles. And I don't know, my dad brought me to the library all the time, and I was very interested in all the events of the world. I mean, the whole 68 convention, et cetera. And then when everything kind of bad happened with Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King getting assassinated, I was 12 years old. But believe me, I look at 12-year-olds today and I go, what made me care about all this stuff back then? I just did. And I went to that whole movement, in my mind, it kind of dissipated in the early 70s. The Vietnam War ended. All these peace people and all the things that maybe I could have been one of those protesters, it all disappeared. I went to college. I'm from a business family, and I got married young. I had kids young, so I just need to make a living. So my theory of why I got into it is that in my heart, I was always an activist. I always wanted to change the world as a youngster. And I always remember when I interview people, I always ask people what they did when they were young. Because it's my theory, and I've read this, I'm not sure if it's backed up by science, but I've read where what people do when they're 10 and 15 is really where their passion is at. And so I always wanted to find out what they did so that they should be working where their passion is. And I sort of accidentally found it at McDonald's by getting into this whole waste issue as my beginning. But maybe they saw this in me. I don't know.
Well, you studied at Kellogg School of Management?
I did,
your MBA there, and was McDonald's your first job out of school?
No, I worked for Kmart in logistics. I worked for Baxter Travenol in logistics. And I remember I went up for a promotion at Baxter to be a higher level, and I was one of the last people eliminated. But I asked the head of HR why I didn't get the job, and he said, well, we see you as a good soldier, not as a good leader. And you talk about ripping me apart. It's like, whoa. And I said, I'm going to leave. And I joined McDonald's in 83, in logistics at that time. And I really had an intention of, well, if I wasn't a good leader, by the way, I was in charge of 250 people, a lot of people in logistics. So maybe I wasn't all that good, but I sure wanted to be a good leader. So I really had it on my mind to do a better job about being a leader once I joined McDonald's.
And I suppose at this point in your career, you weren't really thinking sustainability as you became to know it because it wasn't as much of a thing in the early 80s.
It wasn't a thing at all.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I think the only thing in business that was would be the philanthropy department or community relations. So the idea of any connection of business and society and corporate responsibility, it wasn't anything at that time.
So you went to McDonald's, and it sounds like you went there as a logistics guy. You were running the trucking fleet or working with the trucking fleet at that point. What then got you moved up into the ranks, and how did you find yourself in the middle of what became one of the first, it sounds like, according to your book, black eyes that McDonald's had as one of America's favorite brands?
Well, lucky for me that the logistics portion of McDonald's was also connected to the packaging portion of McDonald's. So, when McDonald's was accused of being a big contributor to the waste crisis, and you have to bring yourself back to the late 80s. And for the listeners that aren't old enough to know at that time, there was really quite a movement and a lot of pressure that the whole world, and not just the United States, was running out of space for trash. And the US EPA was producing studies, and people were thinking, my goodness, we're going to run out of room to put our trash. And so McDonald's was the symbol. The polystyrene clamshell, which we ended up getting rid of soon thereafter, but at that time, it became a symbol. So they asked me to lead a team to evaluate how to recycle it. At one point in time, Park, we had 1,000 restaurants. And at that time, McDonald's in the USA only had 10,000 restaurants. So 10% of our restaurants, we actually had containers and point of purchase materials. We had holes in there for the polystyrene and holes for the trash. And there was a whole organization called the polystyrene recycling industry that was taking it and trying to recycle it. So we were trying to save it. And that was part of my job, was to save the polystyrene clamshell. But in the meantime, we got in so much trouble that we were trying to figure out how to get out of it. My boss, a great leader, Shelby, a general counsel, one of the top 10 executives at McDonald's, he said, Bob, I want you to lead a team for McDonald's that's going to work with the Environmental Defense Fund. And it was a big partnership that we announced in 1990 to open our doors. Really, for the first time at that time, there wasn't really anything precedent for a big company working with a fairly big NGO.
And is this because you were being so attacked, McDonald's was being so attacked by many different outside interests pointing at this trash problem, especially the polystyrene clamshell?
Yes, we had people left and right. What really hurt us particularly were students. The organizers of the campaign on too much waste went to the schools, and we had dozens, if not hundreds, of school kids. We had thousands of letters sent to us. We had thousands of polystyrene clamshells that were used and sent back to our offices in protest. It was really a arrow in our heart, because McDonald's before this was beloved. I mean, heck, we were formed and created in 1955. Now we're 1988. So we had 33 years of, hey, everybody likes McDonald's. We're wonderful in the community. And now for the first time ever, we're being attacked. We didn't know how to handle it. And so we were very desperate, would be a good word, to figure out, well, if we can't figure this out on our own, let's go to credit to the Environmental Defense Fund that they reached out to us. And by the way, their leader then, and he still is there now, Fred Krupp, is absolutely probably the best leader I've ever seen in my lifetime for creating environmental change. He had the guts and the courage. He had more guts and courage reaching out to us, because that was not the mode of how you dealt with companies back then, by collaborating. You did it by being adversarial. You did it by suing them. You did it by doing campaigns and calling them names. And he had this idea that we're going to lower our voices and work with companies for progress. And I just think Fred is a genius. It worked with us because his people were great to work with. I mean, I loved the people. They were smart. They became friends. We went out to dinner. We had fun.
Yeah, because you sort of think of the Environmental Defense Fund maybe as you might lump them in with Greenpeace. Very activist, very noisy. They're out to be disruptive. And so to have them actually partner with a large organization like McDonald's was really kind of new for the era, wasn't it?
Very new. It was precedent setting. And I think the success of it really helped spawn, a lot more partnerships. Certainly the Environmental Defense Fund, it became a big part of their brand. was that they could collaborate with companies.
Well, and what struck me about that portion of the book, you talk about he got pushback from the environmental industry and activists saying he was the Benedict Arnold, that he's just now teaming with the bad guys and that sort of thing. And what struck me about that is Adam Warbaugh, a similar type of leader, in that he was one of the first, the youngest president of the Sierra Club.
Mm-hmm.
He moved out of that movement to help Walmart put their strategy together, their sustainability strategy, wrote a book about it, which to me is still one of my go-to books today, Strategy for Sustainability. But he got the same pushback from his peers as well, acting as if he was a turncoat. And yet it kind of underscores, again, as you talk about in the book, this third wave of environmentalism. If the first one was Teddy Roosevelt, conservation of wildlife and wildlands. The second one then was in early 1962 with Rachel Carlson's book, Silent Spring. So this, in effect, as Fred Krupp, I think, pulled out, said now in the mid to late 80s, this is the new third wave of how you go about environmental work and sustainability work. And that is NGOs working side by side, the organizations that can have the single greatest contribution to sustainability, and that's brands the size of a McDonald's.
You're absolutely right about that. And that's why Fred was a genius. And to see Adam, to see what he do, and I remember all the heat that he took, and the heat for all those NGOs that kind of teamed up with Walmart. But without Walmart, I can tell you from the McDonald's perspective, when Walmart joined the sustainability bandwagon, whatever you want to call it, it was one of the best things that ever happened. Because one company can't be asking its suppliers to do all these things. And so the more companies that we can get on board asking for sustainability, it just raises the bar, it raises the consciousness, it makes it real for a bigger community. And sometimes in the early days, I felt we were in an island by ourselves. So really, sustainability really requires a bigger community. And for all the critics in the world, it's like, hey, the real world is there are Walmarts, there are McDonald's, and you could argue that they don't belong in the world as some people believe. But the fact is, and that's why I wrote the book, I think so many people don't understand what goes on in a company. And that's really one of the chief things I wanted to achieve is people had a stereotype. They certainly do about McDonald's. I mean, I still remember when I published my book earlier this year, I went to my first book festival, and I was really anxious to kind of pitch my book and talk to people interested in it. And the very first person that came up to me, an older woman, and she looked at me and she turned from quixotical to almost having an evil stare. She looked at the title of my book and she goes, McDonald's, sustainability? That is not even possible. She walked away in a huff with anger before I could even talk to her. So I go, hey, people don't, understand. I'm not trying to say McDonald's is good. I don't make that claim in the book. I tell the story of what we did and where we tried hard, where we maybe succeeded, where we failed. But I really want to bring the real world to people that don't understand that there are companies that are really diligent and working hard at these things. And I want the reader to get a feel for what it's really like.
And isn't that so interesting how the brand perception has changed that dramatically in 40 or 50 years, where, McDonald's was the beloved hamburger brand. Growing up in the 60s myself, I remember that was always a treat when you got to go to a McDonald's and have, you had Ronald McDonald and all that. And then things really started to change. And so it's not only a matter of managing the sustainability of it, but the brand perception of it. And here, all these years later, after all the good work you and your team did in there, she sees the golden arches, and now that brand means something completely different to her as it relates to sustainability anyway.
It does, and it's always bothered me. The number one complaint we had amongst the McDonald's employees and staff was, why don't we let people know more what we're doing? I would go out to speak to people on the outside world, and I would start saying, hey, here's what we're doing on waste. Here's what we're doing on animal welfare. Here's what we're doing on nutrition. Here's how we work with Greenpeace on the Amazon. And they would all look at me like, really? You're doing work like that? Hey, that's amazing. Why don't you tell more people? And it's one of my challenges, and I know, Park, you work in this area of communicating, and it's always baffled me why communicators and marketers in general feel a fear of getting out there and talking in these areas. They have a fear of opening up Pandora's box. They want everything wrapped in a bow. They want all communication to be perfect. And, sustainability isn't like that. It's like, in order to be credible on sustainability and sharing your story, you got to talk about the problems, the barriers, along with the successes. You got to be very honest and straightforward. And I see this lacking across the board. And I think that's why you still have the vast amount of consumers not really understanding the real world of what's happening in these companies on sustainability. I think corporate sustainability is one of the biggest movements there is in the corporate world over the last 20 years, but much of it is under the radar screen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, almost every Fortune 500 company's got an officer on sustainability. They have a staff. They put out reports. They have goals and targets. So you can't tell me this isn't real. However, are they doing a whole lot to make this part of their brand, their purpose, their marketing strategy? No, they're not. So I think that's a big broke.
In your book, you were talking too about someone within the Environmental Defense Fund when they were working with you. By the way, the first thing I want to ask you on that is, I was surprised when I saw that the relationship was initially inked, if I read it correctly, for just 6 months with them.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, in hindsight, I would think, well, is McDonald's really serious about this? What can you possibly achieve in 6 months with such a gigantic operation as that, putting their big toe into sustainability? Was that ever a concern from you, or did you feel like you could have significant impact in just a half a year?
Well, if anything, it was more a strong point for the Environmental Defense Fund. They wanted to have a partnership that didn't go on forever. So they wanted a time frame. And by the way, it wasn't to produce results in 6 months. It was to produce an action plan.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the difference. So they wanted something time bound. Let's get in there, and by the way, it was time bound. And we worked, it was basically a full-time job for me and our team, working for 6 months to study what we could do. And we spent a lot of time studying all these alternatives. And I felt it was a good time to study the alternatives. And then we made a pledge that we had a list of 42 initiatives that we could reduce, reuse, recycle. And we kept track of that. So it was the start of a process, not the end. And that list of things we could do to reduce, reuse, recycle grew to over 100, because we kept track of that all during the 90s. And we ended up, reducing 300 million pounds of waste cumulatively during those 10 years. So I actually think that was actually one of the stronger parts of it.
Okay.
Is that,
so it had the urgency to it that you needed to really have the impact.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also in that time period, you said there was a faction, it sounded like, in McDonald's that was still not keen on getting rid of the clamshell, but you were going to put together this large national recycling program and hopefully even make it worldwide and become a leader in recycling. But that ended up failing. And you mentioned that it was your first and last time, I think you call it a fool's errand, in the realm of greenwashing. But I would say you probably weren't intentionally greenwashing. Nobody, so often people actually don't mean to greenwash. They're trying to do something great, but it just doesn't make sense operationally, business model, or whatever. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree with it. And it's a complicated story. And it's, the chapter 1 was a really interesting chapter to write, because I start the book on Halloween of 1990. I mean, we were just one day away from an officer to company announcing a national recycling program. What I talked about earlier, we're going to recycle polystyrene containers in all of our restaurants. We were going to make that announcement. We were one day, I read the press release. And then my bigger boss, Shelby, the chief lawyer for the company, in the meantime was lobbying the president of the company to get out of the polystyrene clamshell. And EDF had just talked to our top management, talked about the toxicity of it, talked about styrene and benzene and the worker exposure, kind of spooked our top management. So we had both of these forces going on the day before. And then that very next day, basically a decision was to pull the plug on the national announcement and go with getting out of the polystyrene container. Very interesting back and forth. And I tried to bring to the reader, I mean, this happens in all these companies. It's not greenwashing. It's like part of me says in retrospect, like we talked today about the problem of plastic recycling, don't we? What do we do with all the plastic in the world? So what McDonald's did at that time is we abandoned it. Okay, so you could do a scenario where, let's say we stuck with it. And what if we were legitimately recycling it over time and it grew and it became real? Maybe that's better for the world. I'm just being analytical about all these pros and cons, because making a decision from one to another, there's many bad aspects to the paper packaging that we replace polystyrene with. So nothing is perfect. Everything has, impacts. So paper packaging is pretty polluting as well, except it doesn't come from oil. It doesn't come from, non-renewable resources. So it's always complex to consider all these things.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I guess I called out that one line in your book is because to me, greenwashing is an intention, to befuddle the public, to suggest you're doing one thing and you're really doing something else. In your case, and I think in so many cases, it wasn't really greenwashing. You guys were trying to do the best for all parties involved and just realized in that process that maybe, continuing to have these clamshells was not the right idea. There was a better way to go about that.
And it's hard to explain all this to the public,
Yeah.
because as we spoke earlier, it's not like you share all this information, either. And if anything, I wrote an article that got quite a big pickup a few years ago. If anything, I think there's a bigger problem with green muting, people laying low versus greenwashing. So I really think the bigger issue is there's way more people green muting versus greenwashing today.
And green muting meaning what? They're just not talking about what they're doing?
They're not talking about what they're doing.
Yeah, I'm
Because
seeing that.
What's the reward? What's the risk reward? All you do, I see the examples today. Oh, people make climate pledges. Oh, where's the, show me what you're really doing. 190 business leaders, sign a pledge that purpose is as important as profit, and people rip them apart. Oh, where's all your proof points? Well, hey, when a CEO puts his name on a pledge, that's pretty meaningful. Why are we ripping these people apart? We should be making it easy for them to do more. So I'm more on board with the idea that I don't like all the criticism that happens with companies trying to do good works, because the critics tend to pick you apart, and it makes the communicators and especially the lawyers want to say lay low. And I'm telling you, I've dealt with a lot of leaders in this space because I'm part of this Green Biz network of professionals. And, we constantly talk about how lawyers have a big power in companies, and almost everything that is written by the communications department is a red line down as something, generic and meaningless by the time it gets out. And you can't have real good communication and connect with consumers that way.
Do you think it's even harder now, 30 years later, from 1989 to 2019, to talk about your good works, because it seems like it's such an age of outrage? People are just looking to throw stones at anything, even though you're trying to do your best?
I think there's many elements that are harder, and there's some elements that are better. So it's a little bit of a mixture. So at least today, now you have sustainability language, whatever it is. The language isn't all that great, but you do have, metrics, and people understand goals and targets, and, how to do materiality analysis. And there's a whole bunch of NGOs out there that are working with companies to do good, like the World Wildlife Fund, Conservation International. So there are groups out there that are going to help you and back you up. So it's not all bad, is what I'm describing, but I would say it's still dominated by this idea that we're looking for where your flaws are. And if a company's going to say, "Hey, look what I'm doing on the environment," they're going to say, "Well, okay, that's one thing for the environment. Look at how you treat your people, or what are you doing with the animals?" It's just like there's never can be happy about that. So I think with all the media that's available today and the level of transparency, it is a challenge because companies don't like to be transparent. I always said in my work that I led is if we're if we're not happy about something that's going to be on the front page of the New York Times, or somebody takes a photo somewhere and we're not comfortable with it, well, let's change it. I'm all for. I always said I should have a camera in my head, and because I saw every aspect of McDonald's. I saw the internal, external. I've been to all the suppliers. I've been to farms. I've been to production facilities. I dealt with nutritionists, animal welfare activists, environmental activists, human rights activists. I've seen the whole gamut. And I just wish they would see everything that I would see, because I think they would have a better opinion of McDonald's. They would see a company that's imperfect, but they would see a real company with good people trying to do good work.
And why that's all important, as you said earlier, are the McDonald's and the Walmarts of the world are not going away. And so they're doing their part, and they have enormous impact, and it can be positive impact in the world. You talk about EDF again in there, and one of the ladies on the team said she was surprised that when McDonald's decided to add an extra slice of tomato to a burger, that you had to let the whole tomato growing industry know 3 months in advance that you would be consuming that many more tomatoes. So it has that kind of impact. And it made me think of a time you and I got a chance to meet about 4 or 5 years ago at ASU when I was teaching in their Executive Masters of Sustainability program. And I was doing a little bit of research for our meeting. And I went online and I was looking through McDonald's, and they were sharing some vendor videos of making hamburger buns. So I thought, oh, this is kind of interesting. Maybe it'll just show me, what is there sustainability built into this or whatever. What struck me about that video, I think it might have been a supplier right outside of Chicago, is it was a waterfall of hamburger buns coming off of this assembly line, and it was nonstop. And it underscored to me, oh my goodness, it is a waterfall of fast food that is being pushed out through all of these McDonald's. And it looked like it was endless. And what struck me about just the amazing impact, both, using resources and delivering, food to people that a McDonald's have. So in your work, after working, getting rid of the clamshell and doing other things, then you get leveled up. And now you at McDonald's have to figure out animal welfare. Is that right? Was that your next step? Like, how do we, maybe one of the largest producing hamburger, company in the world, and the welfare, incumbent upon that, animal welfare, how can you take that job on with a straight face?
Well, I did.
I know you would have to.
My boss said, we were getting a lot of pressure during the late 80s and the 90s to do more in animal welfare. And to be honest with you, we were baffled. My boss was baffled. He was a top lawyer, and what can we do? I mean, you got to remember back then, even today, how to deal with suppliers that are very upstream is a difficult issue. It's like, Bob, he would tell me, we only buy from, the patty makers. They buy the meat from a slaughterhouse. The slaughterhouse buys it from somebody else that buys it from the rancher. How are we ever going to actually deal with the animals? So we struggled with how to do it. And then when I was given the assignment, what I decided to do was go to our arch nemesis, basically go to our chief critics. And the two critics that we had that were animal rights activists were Henry Spira. He headed up Animal Rights International, and Peter Singer, who wrote the book on animal rights called Animal Liberation. And I had a meeting with them in New York City. I describe it in the book, but here I am. I'm telling you, you can't get a younger guy more nervous. I really don't know anything about animals, yet I'm in charge of producing an animal welfare strategy. I'm going to the enemy, supposedly in quotes, and I'm going to ask them for advice. And I'm waiting for them to be really obnoxious and jerky towards me. And these people, Henry and Peter, they couldn't have been nicer. They were some of the smartest people I ever met. They had good ideas. We had a good conversation. They understood the McDonald's problem of how do we actually influence suppliers that are 3 or 4 steps, upstream from us. But, the benefit of me getting with them is, besides getting into their mindset, which I like to do, I really like to get into the mindset of those that are critics of us. Because, by the way, my view of them is they're not the enemy. So I was kidding around when I said that. I view the people that have criticized McDonald's, my first way I look at them is that they really care about what they're doing. They have a lot of passion. I consider myself to be the same. I care. I love making a difference. My job is to make a difference at McDonald's. My first assumption is that these people are good people that have a good cause until they prove me differently. So that was my attitude going in. And hey, Peter and Henry, they told me, Bob, you should work with Dr. Temple Grandin. Didn't know her at the time. And for your listeners who don't know who Dr. Temple Grandin is, she is one of the most phenomenal scientists in all the world. She's the best animal behavioral scientist around. She still is today. She's autistic. It makes her very special. And before you know it, I'm partnering with her. She's telling me how animals learn and behave. We teamed her up with our suppliers, and we figured out a way to implement an animal welfare program that really, really made a difference. And it all started with, listening to our critics and then working, with sort of a critic, Dr. Temple Grandin. What's good about her is she's like the best type of critic. She wants those animals treated correctly. But, we would finish our work and we'd go, to a place to have, a steak for dinner. So she wasn't out to destroy the industry either. And those are really the best people to work with that have a passion and expertise, but they're not looking to destroy you either. The Environmental Defense Fund was that way. WWF is that way. These are organizations and people that care, know what they're doing. They want to push you to do good, but they want your business to succeed at the same time.
Well, and she is so amazing in her field. I mean, HBO even did a documentary on her, Temple Grandin. It's told as a story, but it's really about her life. And she was an amazing individual. Of all the people you got to work with, I would imagine she was one that really has stood out in your professional career.
Well, she's the top, and even as you speak, I just get goosebumps, thinking about her. So she made a big difference in my life because what she did for me somewhat early in my career, I got to see how her force of her will, her force of her personality. I mean, she was a one-woman show, and how she, as one person, could be so influential. I mean, she was a rock star in the industry, and she was respected by all sides. How many people do you find that are respected by, the people on the left, the people on the right, the people in the middle? The animal rights people liked her. The animal industry liked her. We liked her. Our suppliers liked her. She was, I think being autistic, she didn't have a political bone in her body. She just was like, she was out there to do good for these animals, period. No hidden agenda, no filter for that. And it helped me, not that I could copy. I always thought I wanted to be apolitical in all my work. And then I team up with Temple, and I realized, boy, maybe I do kind of position myself this way and that way with different audiences, whereas Temple, she's just about the biggest straight shooter you could ever find.
And she talked to you, or taught you, I guess, as you mentioned it, the 3 Ps of whenever you're trying to tackle something large that seems like it's untackleable: passion, patience, and persistence. Can you tell us how that showed up in your work at McDonald's?
Yeah, that became my kind of my mantra over the years, and it started with her. That's what I saw in her. And I said, then as I got into all the work of sustainability, and, it can be for the people that are in the trenches, like I was, my team, others that are listening to this show, it's like sometimes you really feel, my team would often come back and say, Bob, we're taking 2 steps backwards. We're getting a lot of resistance. Why can't we go faster? And then I would always get the conversation to go, look where we've been with sustainable fish. Look where we have come over the last 5 years. Yes, we took 2 steps backwards over this last couple of weeks, but we've taken 4 steps forward in the last 3 months as well. So the sustainability profession is really good at one of the Ps, which is passion. So, I don't think I have to talk much about the need to have that. I think the other 2 are interesting because you have to be patient, which is really hard to do when you're passionate. But if you want to move people, you can't move people in a company and leadership and suppliers by some sort of like mandate. Oh, let's go treat the animals better, and tell them to do that. It doesn't work that way. For the Temple Grandin effort, it took 3 to 5 years. So when they get exposed, when they learn, they become aware. The whole idea, is to get them to want to do it themselves. So that's how you have to work the sustainability field, which takes patience. But then you also have to be persistent, because in your work, if you sit around and let things go by osmosis, you're not going to be moving. I always thought we were playing a chess game. So every day I want to move sustainable beef. Okay, how many moves can I make? Yeah, whether it's 1 inch, 2 inches, something to always move it along. That's persistence. So if you think of all three at once, it's almost living a life in schizophrenia, because they fight against each other. But I believe that's the space you need to operate in the same day, have all those three things going on at the same time.
Well, and that can be kind of a rule for anything that you're trying to achieve, whether it's in the sustainability world or to build a purpose-driven brand or just even personal development. It seems like those 3 P's of passion, patience, and persistence are really nice guiding posts to live by.
I think they are.
In that, and you talked about it, conflict. You are always going to have conflict. So passion helps you come up against that conflict and work through it. Patience is sometimes it doesn't move as quickly as you like, but you got to be patiently persistent. You can't give up on it. How have you used conflict as an opportunity, both inside McDonald's? You were there for 33 years?
Yes, 33 years.
And then since then, in your consulting work, how can people, instead of railing against conflict, embrace it as an opportunity to help propel their story forward?
Well, my first view of conflict, and I started to realize somewhere mid-career that conflict was a really good thing. And since I like sports, and I played sports, and I played tennis, and I've tried to be competitive in tennis, I had a lot of conflict in tennis. How am I going to beat this person? How is my team going to win? How can I get better? You have this natural friction of where you're at and where you need to be. So part of it came from a little bit of my sports thinking, that you need the conflict to challenge your thinking, to move yourself forward. I think once faced with conflict, the best way to look at it is to look at it through the lens of the people that are creating the conflict. Where are they coming from? And I would always talk to my team. And when I work with companies and other sustainability professionals today, I most often say, you should not be a pusher of what your sustainability agenda is. Instead, you have to realize that the people you're trying to move, either they're neutral or they don't care. Many of them have a conflict that they see this as time that they don't want to spend, or they could even be more emotionally against what you're trying to promote. But I always say the best way to get past the conflict is always spend 95% of your time thinking like them. I would not spend time thinking about what I think is the right thing to do. I'd always have a mindset of what that is, but it doesn't really matter what I think. I have to get the people in charge of beef to see that sustainable beef is an opportunity for McDonald's. And when somebody tells me that, a sustainable Big Mac's not going to, do us any good at McDonald's, I have to figure out a way to have him think about how this could be a good opportunity for having a more secure and relevant, beef supply chain, et cetera. So, some way of making it good for them. And I think really respecting the people that are coming at you with other ideas. I remember once, so I was always known at McDonald's, I'm the one that speaks to all the people that don't like McDonald's. And people will come to our annual meeting. I remember this group called Corporate Accountability. They're still out there. They're very anti-McDonald's. They got some really ugly campaigns against trying to force Ronald McDonald into retirement. They recruit nutritionists to say that we're poisoning young kids, that we have predatory advertising. I mean, the list goes long about all the ugly stuff they say about McDonald's. And yet I still would meet with them. I talk to their leadership. I sit down, and I was at a meeting with all the lawyers at McDonald's, and somebody asked me, what is it that, that you talk to these folks and you seem to get along with them? I go, I respect them. They're trying to figure out a way to make kids healthier and, get rid of obesity, and why not? I'm all for that too. Now they have they have certain ideas about McDonald's I certainly don't agree with. But how are you going to get anywhere unless you at least respect where they're coming from and respect them as human beings? So that's just how I felt. And if we disagreed, hey, so be it. Doesn't mean I don't like that person.
Now, is that a communication technique, Bob, you felt like you learned, or do you think it's something that's innate in you? Because I think 9 out of 10 of us would want to rail back. We get defensive, we take it personally, and we don't take the time to truly understand and appreciate their position in the world.
Well, yeah, maybe it's 50-50. I mean, I hope some of it's I learned, but certainly my personality is one of peace and harmony and collaboration. That's kind of where I come from, as being a person, growing up. I want to get along with people and collaborate. But if anything, my boss told me a few times during my annual reviews, he goes, Bob, you collaborate too much. You got to get stuff done quicker. And I would tell Jack, I said, well, Jack, these things, we can't just mandate change and get people to think differently about McDonald's. We have to kind of be patient about it. So I think what I learned along the way is that it works, by the way. It works to do this. So the more I realized that, hey, when Greenpeace, one of my favorite chapters in the book is about Greenpeace, and they attacked us, and they showed up in restaurants in the UK dressed up as chickens and had breakfast and chained themselves to their table and chairs. And it was all about too much soy in Brazil cutting down, the rainforest there, the Amazon rainforest. And, I could have easily said, Greenpeace, screw you. What are you doing? Why are you picking on us? We're 1/10 of 1% of buying soy through our suppliers. We're not a big deal on this type of thing. But no, we didn't do that. I didn't do that. I respected where they came from. I learned that what they did was their study was accurate. Ended up having a conversation with them that was very wonderful conversation, like two people talking. A couple days later, there's 8 of us, half from McDonald's, half from Greenpeace, talking about how to work together. So if you go in with the idea that you can get past these, I'll call them artificial stereotypes, I say 9 times out of 10, you could make it good for your company and good for the cause at hand. I'm not guaranteeing that it's a solution for everything, because some groups are impossible to work with. But I still think the majority of the time it can work, and companies shouldn't be afraid of it. NGOs shouldn't be afraid of it.
So even that communication technique has the 3 Ps associated with it, doesn't it? Passion, to really understand and appreciate that person's side of the story, the patience to hear them out without jumping down their throats, and then the persistence to, I would imagine, connecting your world with theirs, helping them see your position in it and finding that common ground.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think somewhere in there is you have to have an element of underlying this is you have to be open. You have to be open, truly open. In my consulting practice, I've been asked a few times to get involved with projects where they want to have stakeholder engagement, and they tell me what it's all about. And I realize that their definition of stakeholder engagement wasn't to listen, learn, maybe change based on what you hear. And that's my mantra is listen, learn, absorb. Maybe there's something here that can make us better. Let's talk about it. But these organizations that I'm talking about, they said, no, we don't want to do that. We want to convince them what we're doing is the right thing to do. So it requires openness, that you actually, if you hear something that perhaps needs to be changed, that you actually want to, you'll work on it.
So you covered this in a recent, really great TED Talk at Edinburgh when July, this past summer, that you presented. The title is what? Adversaries as Allies. That's easy for me to say. Adversaries as Allies.
Good thing I didn't screw saying that up in my TED Talk.
Well, I know how that goes. I haven't done a TED Talk. I've done a TEDx. I know how much practice goes into that.
Yeah, that's right.
But tell us about that experience and everything that you've learned that was shared through that. And we'll have a link in the show notes where people can go and check that out. But it really sounds like, versus everything that you experienced in your sustainability journey, it kind of came down to this theme, is you've got to get these 2 worlds, these 2 very adversarial worlds together if we're going to have any impact in this moving forward.
Yeah, and that's why I called my book "The Battle to Do Good." I use the term "battle" not in a negative or cynical viewpoint. It's almost like you have a natural battle going on in your park, where companies operate. Companies are for profit; they're meant to make money, and most of the people in a company they're siloed into their four walls of in a good way to make the business profitable. But business is a part of society. And we've learned more and more that, business can't survive unless it's hand in hand with society and getting along with it and connecting in the right way. And so you have this natural friction where, like, a good example of this would be nutrition. So, McDonald's ended up being like a central point for obesity and being blamed for all of that. And remember the Super Size Me movie and Morgan Spurlock, and he did a great job of kind of lampooning the whole issue of, of course, if you're going to eat too much and not exercise, you're going to get sick. But, he used McDonald's as a symbol. So before 2001, during the whole decade, I'm with McDonald's for all these years up until 2000. Believe me, obesity was not mentioned by one person in the world. If you go back to me growing up, obesity wasn't an issue. 80s wasn't an issue. Nobody talked about it in the 90s, hardly at all. Okay, a lot of things happened in the early 2000s. So all of a sudden, the statistics showed that people are getting obese and overweight, especially kids. So you have new information, new science. That's what I refer to. You have this natural friction. We didn't know that before that time. And, here we're, everybody was happy with our food at the beginning. So now it is an issue. It does have an impact. What should we do? So that's why you have to figure out how to deal with the adversaries and not necessarily conclude that they're the enemy. Because, don't you want, obesity to not be around in our society? Don't you want to have a ecologically great place to live for you and your children, et cetera? We share so many same principles, but how we get there can be a challenge. So I believe you cannot arbitrarily and unilaterally decide all these things. A company just can't sit back. And by the way, we don't even have the expertise. Who are we? We make hamburgers. Walmart just sells a whole bunch of SKUs. A company might have expertise on making paper or making watches or something, computers, but they don't know about all these issues. You have to work with the civil society to figure out, because you can't come up with a solution that's not acceptable. What if we worked on animal welfare solutions that the animal welfare people said, well, this is meaningless. So you have to work with them. It's necessary. So to me, it's like fundamental, greens fees. And so get out there and view adversaries as the opportunity to figure out a solution. And if you do it the right way, if you don't wait too long, one of the themes of my book is people wait around way too long. They wait for things to become a problem, a crisis. They get into the media, the lawyers get involved, politicians get involved. And what are you going to do then? People make a rush to judgment. You make bad decisions. They could be uneconomical. The best way to deal with these issues is early on. When you see something coming, you have the time to reach out. Don't work with the groups that are, I have a rating system I described in the book of working with NGOs on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being very corporate friendly and 10 being radical. I love the groups that are corporate friendly, but they don't really do us that good, I don't think. And I'm not going to work with a radical group that wants to destroy our business. So I'd always look for the 6s and the 7s and maybe the 8s, the ones that are really scientific, they're credible, they're independent, they're not going to kowtow to any company. However, they see the world the same way that maybe I do. And many people in the sustainability field where you can find with logic, with the 3 Ps.
Hey, there we go.
With the 3 Ps, if we can get a good group from the NGO and a good company together, believe me, using the patience and persistence and passion, we could find solutions that satisfy both. I'm very passionate about that. I think the work at McDonald's has proved that. So many other companies are proving it day in, day out, and we need more to join on board.
And you want NGOs partnering with you that are going to challenge you as well. right?
Oh, yeah, that's part
That scale.
That's part of that 5, 6, 7 scale.
Yeah. Yeah. If they're 5 or below, they tend to kind of go along and appease you, maybe offer guidance, but don't really push you. And you start moving it up to the 6, 7, 8s. And now you've got someone in there that's going to light that fire under your butt and hold you accountable to things, but also be reasonable in their requests.
Exactly. I remember we worked with the Conservation International to develop the environmental scorecard. It's one of the best things we did at McDonald's. We developed this environmental scorecard to measure water, waste, and energy for all of our major suppliers. And we didn't want to do it on our own, so we worked with Conservation International. And we formed sort of like a committee, not a committee, but a task force of our suppliers, and basically put the CI people right there with them to work together. Now, this project, which ended up having a great result, but it took probably 3 years. I talked earlier about how these changes, they take a lot of time. And I always talk to Jim Buchanan at Conservation National, who I just like so much. I go, Jim, how did you have all the patience to bear with us? He said, well, I knew it would take time. And he had the same attitude. It doesn't come overnight. And it took testing. It took suppliers trying it out. It took changes in how we measured it to make it acceptable to all the parties. So, they're willing to stretch you out and challenge you, but they're also willing to hang in there for the big payoff. I mean, the whole sustainable beef movement for WWF working on that, they're playing the long game as McDonald's is. I mean, that's still something that's still in the works. I hope it ends up being one of the best things I ever got involved with, trying to make beef more sustainable. But yeah, you can't go to ranchers who are very independent people and say, hey, we want you to be sustainable tomorrow. When they already think they're sustainable, they're passing on their business to their next generation, and they've been around. And by the way, they're great stewards of the land. They're great people. And there's so much trash talking about American farmers and ranchers. That gets me mad too. They don't know the real world of what it takes to grow food and raise animals.
Well, it goes back to what you said. I wish we had the Bob helmet camera on as you were cruising around, seeing what the actual impact is and actually experiencing it. Because until you do that in anything, in any line of work, especially in sustainability, it's hard to take a stand on it one way or the other unless you actually experience it.
Yes. And so that's a big part of what I always believed in there is get in there, see it, go there, be there. I mean, this 9-day trip I took with through the Amazon with Greenpeace, what an experience.
I can imagine.
I'm just imagining that you're not talking esoterically as so many people are, right now. Oh, all these fires that are burning in Brazil. It sort of can be, I read about it. And to me, it's not esoteric anymore. I've been there. I kind of know a little bit more than the average person. Mm-hmm. I've been to China, seeing how the people, work in our factories making toys. You go to a coalition of motley workers, that were campaigning against us to pay tomato pickers more. I didn't want to sit in my office and figure this thing out. And, a lot of decisions are made that way because, hey, tomatoes, that's downstream from us. I went down there to Immokalee and worked the fields, saw where they lived, spent a couple of days there, talked to the people. And, it makes you much more credible for wanting to change something when you actually experience what it's really like.
Your McDonald days are behind you as an employee of the organization. What are you doing these days, and how are you having an impact in sustainability?
Well, I joined the communication world. So, I write a regular column for the Green Biz group and really enjoy writing. So I've always enjoyed writing ever since I was a little kid. So if I had an alternative career, it would have been to be a journalist. That's why I wrote the book too, because it gave me an outlet for, kind of sharing that journey. So I write, and I have I consult through my own consulting practice called Mainstreaming Sustainability, and I work with the Context Network to help companies with two passions I have. Is one is strategy. When a company or an organization can develop a sustainability strategy, to me that's like climbing to the top of the mountain. And I know it's just the beginning, but once a company gets it into the C-suite as strategy, I love working on that. And I love working with emerging professionals that are trying to learn, since I learned through the School of Hard Knocks things that didn't work, probably more than things that did work. I like to share that with younger
Your
people.
hard knock nuggets at the end of each chapter. I love those.
Yeah, so that was my short, simple way of trying to pass things on to the future leaders of the world.
And Bob, how can people learn more about you and find your book? The book, again, is The Battle to Do Good, Inside McDonald's Sustainability Journey.
Amazon.com, you can get it there. And you can learn more about what I do and even more about the book at boblangert.com, my website as well. And follow me at GreenBiz. I think GreenBiz has got some great stuff, not only my work, but other people as well.
Well, hopefully we'll see you out here in Arizona. GreenBiz in early 2020. They have their conference here every year. It's always a fantastic gathering of sustainability professionals.
Sure is.
Yeah. Well, Bob, thank you so much for taking the time and being on the Business of Story. Fascinating, especially your approach of turning adversaries into allies. And I think we can all learn from that. And you proved it out in the great work you did at McDonald's. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Park.
I'd like to thank you all for listening to this edition. If you liked what you heard here and you've got a colleague in your life, a boss in your life, or you're trying to push a sustainability practice forward, share this episode with them. And by all means, track down Bob's book, The Battle to Do Good, Inside McDonald's Sustainability Journey. It is now one of my favorite reads. My first was Adam Werbaugh, A Strategy for Sustainability. I learned so much from that, but that was, 10 years ago. This is an update in my mind to that. It's like a user manual for how to apply sustainability to your purpose-driven brand and to make a real impact and difference in the world. The other thing I like about it is how Bob wrote it. It is just filled with story after story after story. So he teaches through story, and to me, that's a big thing. So if I can be of service to you, track me down at businessofstory.com. And I'm always here every Monday with amazing story artists like Bob. So please come back next week to hear the next adventure in the Business of Story podcast. And until then, remember that the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thanks so much for listening.